As John mentioned this morning, we do have a lot of folks who were back with us, who've worshiped with us in the past, who've also brought some parents with you. We're really glad to see you. But before I say more about how excited we are to have you back, we certainly don't want our homegrown kids to feel like we don't appreciate you. We appreciate almost all of you. No, actually, we do. We appreciate all of you. You know, and a lot of our kids who have finished high school have gone on ahead to get jobs, or they've finished trade school, like Nick has gone on to get a job, and Zach and Maddie have both finished trade school, and they're both working now. In fact, I would like to adopt them, get some more income coming into my house. Joel and Christy, you know you've got plenty as it is, so let's share the loot a little bit. And of course, Spencer, somewhere in this general vicinity, he's over at USF when we have other kids who are at Hillsborough Community College or other schools. And we're very proud of you, and we're very appreciative of what you mean to us. But then, of course, we also have students who live elsewhere who have come back to begin a new school year in our area and have come back to be with us today. And we are really glad you're here. You encourage us and you energize us as a church. We are, of course, on the cusp of the start of a new school year, but it is a school year unlike any school year in my life. I used to think my fourth grade year was the weirdest year of school ever. For you old timers who are from up north, that was the year of the epic blizzard of '78, when in my hometown in Kentucky, we missed almost literally a solid month of school. We missed so much school that year that we actually had to go 2 Saturdays to help make up the year, the 2 worst days of school of my entire life. So I used to think that was the weirdest year, but I think this one is certainly going to make that look like child's play. So I often do a back to school type of lesson, this time of year anyway, but I thought, especially in view of these circumstances, I wanted to do all that I could to help us focus on how to live for Christ in the new school year. Whether you are homeschooled or public schooled or private schooled, whether you are studying in person or online, whether you are in the first grade or getting ready to finish grad school, or whether you are doing continuing education in the School of Hard Knocks. So I think I just about got everybody in the scope of my objectives this morning. So to streamline our thoughts today, I want you to turn with me to Philippians, the 2nd chapter. I realize, of course, that the Apostle Paul had a purpose for writing this letter to a specific church for specific reasons, and this chapter for sure. But this chapter and this book reflect a bigger picture. It's the picture that Paul gives in his famous statement in chapter 1, verse 21, to live is Christ. That all of life is to be devoted to Jesus Christ. And if every facet of life is to be devoted to Christ, that certainly includes the time we spend at school. So I want to pick out some principles that are true for all Christians for all time, but I do want to give them special application for school. And I want to begin with a point that Paul makes here in chapter 2, which is to think about others more than yourself. In the past, I have always thought of Philippians as the book of joy. And indeed, it says a lot about joy. Philippians 4:4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. But the more I've studied this book, I actually think more than focusing on joy, this book focuses on unity. You see it right at the bottom of chapter 1 when he says in verse 27, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. And then continuing right on into chapter 2, verse 1. So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. How do we live in such a way that we are united in mind and in love and in spirit and heart. Well, Paul tells us in verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition. That's the same word he used back in chapter 1 to describe those preachers who knew that Paul was in prison and could not preach as he once did. And so, to make themselves look good and Paul look bad, they were really preaching it up in some demented effort to try to score points against Paul. Paul says they are preaching with selfish ambition. It's not an ambition to save souls. It's not an ambition to please Christ or glorify God. It's to make themselves look good. That's selfish ambition. The other term he uses here in verse 3 is conceit. I love the word the old King James Version uses. It translates it vain glory. Glory that is vain, empty, or worthless. Like Michael Scott's coffee cup that says world's greatest boss, which would have a lot of value if one of his employees gave it to him, but has much less value since he bought it for himself. So he calls himself the world's greatest boss. That is empty glory. That is vain glory. Paul says, if you want to have the unity that I'm talking about in this letter, you can't have it by pursuing your own ambition, and you can't have it by pursuing your own glory, which is counterfeit in contrast to the glory that we shall receive from Christ. Instead, he says in verse 3, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Think about others more than yourself. We as Christians are so used to thinking of humility as a virtue, it's hard to understand that in Paul's day, humility was not considered a virtue at all. Now, pagans understood that pride was self-destructive, but they considered the term humility to refer to servile weakness. It is in Christianity only that we really see humility exalted as a virtue, because our faith is built around a Messiah who humbled himself, as Paul goes on to say in this chapter, to the point of death, even death on the cross. It isn't, though, as pagans often misconstrued it, some kind of groveling, pathetic weakness. Paul says in this verse, in verse 6 that Christ humbled himself. No one humbled Christ. He did it himself. And he did it for the sake of others. Our natural instinct is not to count others as more important than ourselves. Our natural instinct is to count ourselves as more important than the others, and what Paul is saying is the only way to counter that natural tendency, to guard against a selfish preoccupation with what we want and what we need and what we desire, is to treat others as more important. That's what humility means. Or as he says in verse 4, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Now, who is he talking to? Who does this apply to? Look again at verse 4. Let each of you, every one of us here, is under Paul's injunction not to simply look at our own interests. In fact, most of our English translations soften what Paul is saying here. Most of our English translations insert words like only or merely. Don't look only at your interests. Don't look merely at your interests. That's not found in the original text. The NIV puts it out in its more fundamental terms, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Now, if you're starting school this year, there are going to be a lot of things that are different from previous school years. If you go to school with other people, there will be new and strange procedures, undoubtedly. Wearing a mask, social distancing. Why, some of you middle school boys may actually be asked to wash your hands with soap. That's how strange this new world may be. Some of you may be forced to do online instruction of some kind. And just between us, I hate all of that, except the washing your hands with soap. I do like that. I hate wearing a mask. I'm so hot-natured, it makes me sweat. It's like wearing a personal furnace on my face. My glasses fog up, so I have to take them off so I can't see what I'm doing half the time. I hate online instruction. I do not like teaching you all by video. I'm glad to try to do it, but I miss the interaction, and if I was a student, I would really hate trying to learn that way. But what Paul is calling upon each and every one of us to do is not to be focused on what I want, what I need, what I like, but instead focus on the needs of other people. Everyone right now feels the stress and frustration of the time we live in. And certainly your teachers, your administrators, your parents are overwhelmed with stress and anxiety. Don't add to the load they are already bearing. Try to shoulder some of it for them. These days, it seems like I can't preach a sermon without quoting from the professor, C.S. Lewis, but I just happened to remember in preparation of the lesson something he says in his essay called The Weight of Glory that speaks to this point so beautifully. He says, it may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it. Paul is asking us to take the load of our neighbor on our back, which only humility can carry. We, of course, should always be considerate, no matter what age we are or where we are at. We should always be considerate at school. But this year, commit yourself to thinking more about others than yourself. All right, that's lesson one. Here's lesson number 2. Work out your own salvation. So verse 12 begins, therefore, I'm skipping some verses. We don't have time this morning to go through verses 5 through 8, in which Paul talks in more detail about Christ as the ultimate model of what humble service in the interests of the needs of others looks like. We don't have time to go through verses 9 through 11, which some commentators think is a hymn in honor of Christ's humiliation as a servant, and then also his exaltation, and the day in which every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord to the glory of the Father. But in view of all of that, in view of the example of Christ as the preeminent servant who humbles himself for the sake of the needs of others, therefore, Paul says, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. After all of this emphasis on what Christ has done for us, it should seem a little jarring to our ears to hear Paul say, work out your own salvation. Especially since back at the end of chapter 1, in verse 28, he says at the end of the verse, this is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. Your salvation is from God. You're not earning your salvation. Earlier in the book, he says that God has begun a work in you and will bring it to completion. So if that is the case, what does Paul mean when he says, work out your own salvation? What does it mean to work it out? We know we're not working for it. How do you work out your own salvation? Well, in the way that Paul thinks, salvation isn't just something you receive, it is something you do. What do I mean by that? Normally in Paul's letters, when he uses this term, he is speaking in the future of our ultimate salvation with the Lord. And so it is yet distant, but there is some sense in which Paul is saying we are to work it out right now. So imagine this. Imagine you have a friend who offers you a vacation to Hawaii. I actually have a friend who did that. and I was out of vacation days, which reminds me, elders, I would like to revisit my schedule for the future. So I couldn't go. He was going to pay for everything. So imagine you're going to take your first trip to Hawaii. I did actually get to go. My in-laws took me and Christy with them to celebrate their anniversary. So here's what I know we did. First of all, my wife loved those travel books. If you want to go anywhere, and I mean anywhere in the world, we've got a travel book for you at the house. So you can kind of look forward and you can see pictures of where you're going, and you can kind of scout out some of the activities that you want to do. So we were kind of doing that. And then, maybe you want to go snorkeling in those beautiful waters in Hawaii. So maybe you would take snorkeling lessons to get ready for your trip. And maybe you would even start to learn some Hawaiian phrases so you can speak to the locals. You might even, as the trip gets close, start setting your clock so that you're more and more on Hawaii time, so that when you get there, you can just jump right into it. Now, if you did any of those things, here's what you're doing. You are already living in the present for what is yet to come. It's like what is yet to come is so great. It's backwashing into the present and changing how you live in the here and now. That is exactly what Paul means when he says, work out your own salvation. It means our salvation, which awaits us in the future, is so great that it actually begins to transform us here and now to live like people who are going to heaven. Live out, work out, carry out what that salvation will be even in the here and now. And in the context of what Paul has been talking about, therefore, remember that's how verse 12 began, doing that is a part of what it means to follow the example of Jesus in his humility. Think about it. Why do we get to go to heaven? Because of Jesus. What did Jesus do? He humbled himself. Do you realize that the plan of salvation has as its essence humility? So the way that Paul specifically is talking about living out your salvation now is living out that which is the basis of your salvation, the humility that looks like the humility of Jesus Christ. When we are self-centered, when we are obsessed about my rights and oblivious to the needs of others, then we are not working out our salvation as we are supposed to after the model of Jesus, or in light of God's majesty, which is what Paul goes on to say at the end of verse 12, that we are to do this with fear and trembling. That we should do this with a sense of holy wonder and awe of the majesty of God, but also with a sense of his empowering presence. Look at verse 13. For it is God who works in you. Well, wait a minute. Are we working or is God working? And the answer is, boy, oh boy, that was not very good. Sometimes I wonder, well, yes, for the three of you who responded, the answer is indeed yes. It is both. It is we who work in response to God's grace, but it is God who is empowering us. He empowers us, he works in us to will, to help us have the desire for what we should want, and to work, to be united in the effort to actually carry out what God intends for us to do, and to do so for his good pleasure. It pleases God to equip people to be able to enjoy him forever. So, let's step back and look at verses 12 and 13 together. If you are a student, Paul's point to you is, live right now like a person who's going to heaven, who is saved in eternity. Live in humility, that's his specific contextual point, but much broader, just live like people who belong to God forever. A contrast to this is found at the end of chapter 3, when in verse 18, Paul warns about those who walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, their appetite. Their glory is their shame. They set their minds on earthly things. But our citizenship is in heaven. Do you see his point? We don't live like them because we're going to heaven. And then if you go right on to chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. Living for heaven is not something you do 1 hour on Sunday morning. It's not something you do when your parents are watching, but then you're on your own otherwise. You remember what he said at the start of verse 12 back in chapter 2, that not just in my presence, but more so in my absence. That's all the time. This is how we live all the time. At school, it means you work out your salvation in the way that you treat your friends, in the way that you respect your teachers, in the way you get along with your roommate, in the way that you act when you are on a date. Not just because mom and dad said so, not just because your dorm monitors may get you in trouble or the administration may catch you, but because your longing for heaven is so consuming that it even affects the way you live right now. So think about others more than yourself. Work out your own salvation, and then shine as stars in the world. Now that's where we are headed at the end of verse 15. But let's go back to the start of verse 14 to see how we're going to get there. Do all things without grumbling. When I was in junior high school, in English class, we watched a TV show called Wordsmith. I asked people of my generation, apparently nobody else has seen this show, but I actually found there are clips of it on YouTube, and there's an article on Wikipedia, so it has to be totally legit, right? So Wordsmith, so it was a program that kind of told you about the history of words. And it was on Wordsmith that there was a character named Miss Onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like what it does. Like grumble, 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 murmur, 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 bang, zip. All those words in the old Batman show when they were having a fight. Those are all onomatopoeia. Well, Paul uses a word in his language that's an onomatopoetic word, a word that sounds like what it is. In Greek, it's gongismos, gongismos, gongismos. It's the word that's used to describe Israel in the wilderness, murmuring, complaining. Paul says, don't do that. Or the next word here is disputing. The NIV says arguing. Don't be someone who gripes, and don't be someone who is argumentative. And how broad is this command? Not to be a complainer and not to be contentious. What are the first words of verse 14? Do all things without doing that. So that's my sneaky way to apply this to school. Do all things. Too much homework. I don't like this online platform. My teacher's tests are too hard. The food at the cafeteria is disgusting. I don't like all the new precautions. Let me tell you, this year especially, if you do all things without complaining or arguing, verse 15 will be true, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Language that comes from Deuteronomy to describe Israel. Not Israel as it should have been, but what Israel actually was. Paul is saying, learn from their example. They murmured and complained and debated and argued with Moses. They failed to be the people of God that he intended. Here's the thing that really stands out to me. If I said, complete this sentence, don't do blank so that you will show yourself not to be part of a crooked and perverse generation, what would you have put in the blank? Don't do this. Don't use bad language, and you'll prove yourself not to be part of this crooked, perverse generation. Don't be sexually immoral. Don't do drugs and alcohol. All those things would be fine, but isn't it interesting that in this passage, Paul says, if you want to show yourself not to be part of a crooked and twisted generation, don't gripe and argue. If that has ever been true, it is true now. Just spend 5 minutes on Facebook. Except you guys, we've driven you off of Facebook. You've seen so many bad posts and articles and videos forwarded by your parents and grandparents, you're done with it. I understand. I get that. It's just our culture right now. And so what I'm saying to my friends who are about to go to school is, griping and quarreling is not the way to present ourselves to the world. The end of verse 15 tells us what we are to be, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And actually the word here is stars, which is why the NIV says, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. If you approach your school year with an attitude of cooperation and gratitude, rather than complaining and squabbling, you will stand out like a bright star against the dark canvas of the night sky. When I was in the 8th grade, it was a presidential election year. In fact, it's bad enough that I see friends younger than me bringing kids to go to college to make me feel old. But then when I realized this morning that I was in the 8th grade 40 years ago, I really felt like I was ancient. And since it was a campaign year, and I was just sort of at that age of becoming inquisitive, I became interested. In fact, I even volunteered to represent one of the candidates in the mock election we would have, and we even had a mock debate, and I was going to represent that candidate. My science teacher, Ms. Elders, was a very eccentric person. That's what we call old people who are weird, eccentric. She was very eccentric. She hated the candidate I represented. And as the election came closer, almost on a daily basis, she would go on a harangue in class about how terrible this candidate was. Periodically, I would meekly raise my hand. She would just put your hand down, Shane. And the closer we got, the more squirrely Mrs. Elders got. Well, as it turned out, my guy won and her guy lost. And I have to be honest, the thought crossed my mind to just really brag and boast and let her have it. But I decided, and I honestly don't know why, believe me, it was not from any great virtue, but I just decided, you know what? I'm going to go as far as I can in the other way, not to be quarrelsome and disagreeable. In fact, I can't remember the specifics because it has been so long ago, but it seems like we worked on a school production of some kind backstage together that she was in charge of, and I really made a point to try to be helpful and courteous to her. And anyway, at the end of the school year, at awards night, I was surprised to get some kind of award for good conduct or whatever. And my English teacher, Mrs. Coney, came up to me one day and she said, I just want to tell you something. When the faculty got together to talk about who should get this award, Mrs. Elders brought your name up. And she said she knew she had been hateful to you. And she was impressed that you didn't respond to her in kind. And she's the one who recommended you. Now, I learned something then that was important, which is, sometimes your teachers can be jerks. She was willing to admit it. Sometimes your suite mate can be a jerk. Sometimes there are policies that are, from your standpoint, irritating and pointless. That's why you shine like a star when you don't grumble and fuss about stuff, because it really stands out to people. And who knows, as John prayed in his prayer, John Vayon in his prayer this morning, just like in the ancient world, stars were the way that sailors would navigate their way to their home. It may just be that by acting in a way that is so different from the world, there might be someone you go to school with who sees your light, your star, shimmering and wants to follow your lead to come to know more about God. What if in this unusual school year, you used it as a means to make an impact that otherwise you would not have been able to make, like Paul says he did with the gospel in Philippians 1? I will tell you this, there is one thing I deeply regret about my days as a student in junior high and in high school. My friends knew my politics, my friends knew my sports loyalties, my friends knew about the girls that I liked, but there is one thing they never knew about because I never talked about it. They never knew about my Lord because of me. Paul says in Philippians 1 and verse 13 that everybody knew he was in prison for Christ. Why not live in such a way this year, thinking about others more than yourself, working out your salvation, shining like a star, so that everyone knows why you're in school, which is not ultimately for grades and not ultimately to get a job, but ultimately for Jesus Christ. And then you will truly be living for Christ in the new school year. This, of course, is the message for all of us. It is a humbling message to preach as I think about the ways I need to do so much better, and maybe that is the case for you. But maybe it is the case that as we have exalted Jesus Christ this morning, as we have held forth the word of life, that you are interested in becoming one with him, to put your faith in his death that Ralph talked about today, to be baptized into union with him so that his story of salvation becomes yours, and so that you have something to look forward to and something to live for in the here and now. If we can help you do that, why don't you let us know while we stand and sing.